The banner stretched across the block in polished white lettering, Madison Redevelopment Initiative. Cameras lined the sidewalk. City officials stood in careful rows. The old industrial district had not looked this crowded in years. Victoria Hale stepped up to the microphone with the kind of composure that came from knowing the narrative before it unfolded. Her blazer was sharp, her voice steady, her presence calibrated for broadcast. "This corridor represents opportunity," she said, gesturing toward the aging row of garages. "But progress requires eliminating inefficiencies." The lens turned. Whitaker Auto Repair stood at the far end of the block. The paint on the sign was faded. The concrete beneath it cracked in places that had held too much winter. Daniel Mercer stood inside the open bay, tightening the last bolt on a transmission casing. He had heard the applause before he saw the crowd. Victoria's voice carried down the street. "After inspection, this facility has been declared non-compliant with updated zoning and environmental standards." A murmur moved through the gathered officials. "We are officially shutting it down." The words were clean. Efficient. Final. The cameras pivoted toward Daniel. A reporter stepped closer. "Mr. Mercer, how do you respond?" Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and stepped forward into the sunlight. He didn't look at the crowd first. He looked at the garage, at the lift he had rebuilt twice, at the inspection trench beneath the floor where curved intake arcs once guided vehicles through balanced diagnostics. Victoria met his eyes. "This isn't personal," she said smoothly. "It's modernization." Daniel nodded once. He did not argue permits. He did not mention inspections. He did not point out that the updated compliance requirements were written by her own corporate advisory firm. He simply walked back into the garage. The cameras followed. He unplugged the diagnostic console. He rolled the tool cart against the wall. He checked the alignment of the lift one last time, as though finishing a shift. Outside, Victoria continued speaking. "We're consolidating operations into scalable, integrated facilities designed for sustainable growth." Applause rose. Daniel reached for the overhead chain and pulled the garage door down slowly. The metal groaned as it lowered, each segment folding into the next with deliberate rhythm. When it reached halfway, he paused for a moment. The street was quiet again. Victoria's voice had softened as she moved on to the next building in the redevelopment plan. Daniel finished lowering the door until it clicked shut. He locked it. No protest. No outburst. No plea. Just closure. What Victoria Hale did not realize, what none of the officials or reporters knew, was that the very integrated facility she praised during her speech was built on a workflow system Daniel Mercer had designed 14 years earlier. And the geometry she now dismissed as obsolete was still holding her empire together. The kitchen tile near the sink had been cracked for years. Daniel stepped around it automatically, setting his keys on the counter without looking down. The house was small and steady in ways the street outside never had been. The refrigerator hummed. The stove clicked softly as he turned the burner down. Lily sat at the table with her homework spread out in uneven stacks. Her stuffed rabbit leaned against a glass of milk, its stitched expression permanently calm. "Did they close it?" she asked. Daniel pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Yes." "For good?" He considered the question carefully. "For now." She looked toward the window, where the streetlight cast a faint glow across the driveway. "Are we going to lose it forever?" Daniel shook his head slightly. "Some buildings close," he said evenly, "so others can open." Lily frowned. "That doesn't make sense." He stood and walked to the wall near the pantry door. Framed there was an old factory layout blueprint, yellowed at the edges, graphite lines still precise. The intake lanes curved deliberately instead of running straight. Inspection arcs were layered like overlapping waves. "You see this?" he asked. "Yes. It looks old." "It is. Does that mean it's wrong?" She shook her head slowly. "No." Daniel traced one of the curved lines with his finger. "They shut down the factory built from this design once," he said. "They called it inefficient. But it wasn't." "No." "What happened?" They straightened the curves. Lily tilted her head. Why? Because straight lines look faster. The cracked tile tapped faintly under his heel as he stepped back. Did it work? For a while. She studied the blueprint more closely. So the garage closing is like that? Maybe. Lily slid her pencil across her math worksheet, then stopped. Are you mad? No. Why not? Daniel returned to the table and poured water into his glass. Because I know what's still there. What? The structure. She nodded, absorbing what she could. The cracked tile in the kitchen caught the light. The garage door down the street was locked. The blueprint on the wall remained intact. Daniel didn't see closure. He saw geometry waiting to be restored. Microhook. Daniel doesn't see closure. He sees an opening. 12 years earlier, Riverbend manufacturing sounded different. The conveyors didn't rattle. They moved in arcs, quiet curves that allowed pressure to travel instead of pile up. Workers stepped from station to station without urgency, because the geometry of the floor did most of the work. Daniel Mercer stood in the center of that design. He wasn't a loud engineer. He didn't pitch grand ideas in boardrooms. He walked the line with a clipboard and a pencil, measuring seconds between torque assembly and suspension alignment, adjusting the curve of intake lanes by inches until the flow stabilized. Instead of pushing vehicles straight from inspection to detailing, he introduced curved intake arcs, each car entering a redistribution path where mechanical verification preceded cosmetic presentation. Pressure from one station bled into adjacent ones. No single point carried too much weight. The result was subtle. Turnaround time improved by 38%. Material waste dropped. Warranty claims declined. Worker fatigue eased because load no longer concentrated in bottlenecks. Executives called it innovative. Investors called it scalable. Victoria Hale, then a rising operations executive, called it lean modernization. The system became the backbone of the company's expansion. New facilities copied the layout. Curved arcs replaced straight lanes. Balanced inspection checkpoints reduced rework. The numbers glowed green. Then Claire got sick. The hospital corridor replaced the production floor. The hum of conveyors was replaced by the soft beep of monitors. Daniel still reviewed timing intervals at night, scribbling notes on napkins while Lily slept in a chair beside him. When Claire died, the board offered him vice president of systems. He declined. I need to stay close to home, he said quietly. They understood in theory. In practice, restructuring continued without him. Consultants arrived with efficiency charts and aggressive quarterly targets. They studied Riverbend's arcs and saw delay where Daniel saw balance. Straighten the lanes, one suggested. Remove redundant checkpoints. Increase throughput. Daniel warned them. You'll create downstream pressure. We'll manage it. They didn't. The curves were straightened. Buffer zones were eliminated. Cosmetic inspection resumed priority over mechanical alignment because it looked faster on reports. Production numbers rose temporarily. Then defects began returning quietly. Daniel documented the projections. He filed the memos. They were acknowledged. Then archived. He stepped down 6 months later without announcement. His name faded from revised workflow diagrams. The curved arcs remained in some older facilities, but new builds followed straight lines. The Riverbend factory he designed was eventually labeled inefficient. The blueprint on his kitchen wall remained unchanged. He kept the original drawings, folded carefully, graphite lines crisp despite the years. He reviewed them occasionally, not out of nostalgia, but clarity. The geometry still worked. It always had. Microhook, he kept the original blueprints. The Riverbend plant sat 3 miles beyond the industrial corridor, its brick facade dulled by time and neglect. The parking lot was empty except for a single security vehicle idling near the gate. Daniel stood outside the chain-link fence for a long moment before unlocking it. The doors were heavy. They resisted at first, then opened with a slow metallic groan. Dust settled across the factory floor like quiet snowfall. But the structure beneath the dust was intact. The curved intake lanes he had designed were still visible beneath the faded paint. The inspection trench ran exactly where he remembered it. The overhead cranes hung idle, but the rails were straight. The buffer zones were still marked faintly on the concrete. They hadn't dismantled the geometry. They had simply stopped using it. Daniel walked the arcs slowly, tracing the curve with his boot. The straight-line modifications from restructuring were layered awkwardly on top of his design, like corrections made without understanding the original intention. He knelt near the central junction. The anchor bolts were rusted but stable. The infrastructure wasn't obsolete. It was dormant. That evening, he made a call. "I need to put in an offer," he told a private investment partner he trusted. "For what?" "Riverbend." The partner hesitated. "That plant was shut down." "I know." "You think you can compete with Vaughan?" Daniel didn't answer directly. "I know what's still inside it." The offer moved quietly through intermediaries. No press release. No bidding war. Just a structured acquisition proposal submitted before demolition permits were finalized. 2 days later, Victoria Hale's executive assistant entered her office. "There's a purchase offer on Riverbend," she said. Victoria barely glanced up. "From who?" "A private group connected to Daniel Mercer." She smiled faintly. "The garage?" "Yes." "It's sentimental," she replied. "He probably wants to preserve history." The board approved the sale without much discussion. Riverbend had already been written off as inefficient infrastructure. The transaction closed quietly on a Friday afternoon. Victoria didn't notice. She was focused on new developments downtown. 3 days later, Daniel stood alone in the center of Riverbend's factory floor with the keys in his hand. The dust still lingered in the air. The arcs were still there. The structure waited. Victoria Hale did not notice the transaction. Not yet. Microhook, Victoria doesn't notice the transaction until production begins. Daniel did not begin with machines. He began with chalk. On the first morning after acquiring Riverbend, he walked the floor alone, measuring the curves that still faintly marked the concrete beneath layers of straight-line paint. He traced the original intake arcs with careful strokes, restoring the geometry that had once balanced the system. The straight modifications installed during restructuring were removed slowly. Steel rails were repositioned. Inspection checkpoints were reinstated where they had been eliminated. Buffer zones between torque assembly and suspension alignment were rebuilt from salvaged materials. He called former workers quietly. "Are you open?" one asked. "Yes." "Running the old system?" "The right one." They returned without banners or speeches. By the end of the first week, 8 technicians stood on the floor, moving through the restored arcs like they had never left. The rhythm returned naturally. Pressure redistributed instead of accumulating. Daniel recalibrated timing intervals by seconds, not minutes. He shortened the lag between intake inspection and drivetrain correction without removing the step entirely. The difference wasn't dramatic. It was disciplined. On day 9, the first limited production run began. High-efficiency drivetrain components, identical to those still manufactured by Vaughan Automotive, rolled down the line. But the inspection checkpoints caught minor torque misalignments before they reached detailing. Suspension balancing was verified fully instead of sampled. Waste dropped immediately. Material loss declined by nearly 15% in the first 2 weeks. By day 15, the production report reflected what Daniel already expected. Turnaround time improved by 32% compared to Vaughan's straight-line facilities. Defect rates were lower. Rework nearly vanished. He did not advertise it. He sent the first shipment quietly to a regional distributor who had once sourced from Vaughan. The distributor called 2 days later. "These units are cleaner," he said. "Fewer alignment issues." Daniel responded simply. "They're balanced." On day 22, Riverbend completed its second batch. Efficiency metrics now exceeded Vaughan's flagship plant by 8%. No robotics added. No workforce expansion. Just geometry restored. By day 27, word spread quietly among supply chains. Orders shifted. Not dramatically, but steadily. On day 30, Daniel reviewed the pricing structure for the first public shipment under his own brand. He calculated true cost, labor, material, overhead, without inflated buffer for rework or warranty return. The final number was 14% below Vaughan's listed pricing. He sent the invoice. Within 48 hours, Victoria's regional sales team noticed a discrepancy. Orders that once flowed automatically to Vaughan were redirecting toward Riverbend. The first shipment undercut her pricing model. And it did so without compromise. Microhook, the first shipment, undercuts Victoria's pricing model. The numbers changed before the narrative did. At first, it looked like seasonal variance. Regional distributors reported minor adjustments in sourcing, nothing alarming, just slight decreases in Vaughan Automotive's Midwest corridor. Then the pattern stabilized instead of correcting. Warranty claims in the same region declined for vehicles supplied by Riverbend. Reconditioning callbacks dropped. Fleet managers began referencing the balance units in procurement emails. Vaughan's quarterly operations dashboard flickered from green to amber. In the executive boardroom, the analytics director adjusted his glasses and projected the comparative metrics. Defect rate differential is consistent, he said. Riverbend's output shows lower torque misalignment and reduced suspension drift. Victoria leaned back slightly. How significant? 8%. Cost differential? 14% under our pricing. Silence pressed across the table. Who authorized this? One director asked. No acquisition, the analytics director replied. Independent operation. Victoria's gaze sharpened. Pull archived production models, she said. The screen shifted. Workflow layout, version 1.3. Designer, Daniel Mercer. The curved arcs were unmistakable. The buffer zones. The timing intervals. The geometry. The analyst overlaid Riverbend's current production map against the archived Vaughan layout from 14 years ago. They were nearly identical. Is that? One director began. Yes, the analyst said. He reinstated the original geometry. Victoria leaned forward. When was this model altered? Restructuring year 2. And who signed off? The document opened. Executive authorization, Victoria Hale. Her own signature rested at the bottom. The room went quiet. We believe straight-line throughput improved efficiency, she said evenly. It improved short-term output, the analyst corrected. It increased downstream correction costs. Victoria exhaled slowly. The distributor's shift wasn't emotional. It was structural. Riverbend was delivering consistent units at lower costs because the system reduced waste at intake rather than absorbing it later. Why didn't we see this earlier? One board member asked. Because quarterly margins mask cumulative defects, the CFO replied. Victoria closed the file. How much market share? Enough to affect forecasting. The reality settled. Daniel hadn't undercut Vaughan through volume. He'd undercut it through precision. Victoria stood. Schedule a meeting, she said. With whom? Daniel Mercer. Around the table, no one objected. The shift was measurable. And the signature at the bottom of the archived document made it undeniable. Microhook, Victoria discovers her own signature on the original workflow authorization. Victoria arrived at Riverbend without a motorcade. The parking lot was half full. No cameras. No banners. Just trucks idling near the loading dock and workers moving along curved intake arcs with deliberate rhythm. Daniel stood near Station 4, reviewing alignment data on a clipboard. He looked up when she approached, then nodded once. You're running below maximum throughput, she said. On purpose, he replied. She watched the floor for a moment, the curved arcs, the staggered checkpoints, the quiet flow of pressure redistribution. We're losing regional share, she said. You're losing margin to waste, he corrected. You straightened the arcs, he continued. It looked faster. It was, she replied. For a quarter. Silence stretched between them. She glanced toward the central intake lane. You didn't retaliate, she said. You rebuilt. He shrugged lightly. I restored. You could have forced acquisition negotiations. I don't need them. Her gaze sharpened. You've positioned yourself to compete nationally. No. To survive without us. Yes. She exhaled slowly. What do you want? Engineering oversight. She raised an eyebrow. For all facilities? Yes. No structural simplification without long-term modeling review. Worker retention protections written into contract. Curved intake geometry reinstated. She studied him carefully. And ownership? Riverbend stays independent. You're not interested in selling. No. And if we refuse? He glanced across the floor at the workers moving in steady rhythm. You'll keep paying for imbalance. The statement wasn't aggressive. It was factual. She paused. The board will push for acquisition. They can consider it. You won't accept. No. Silence. You're not angry, she observed. No. You don't seem interested in humiliating us. That wouldn't fix the system. The hum of conveyors filled the space between them. Victoria nodded once. I'll take this to the board. They've seen the numbers. She looked back toward the arc that had once been dismissed as inefficient. And if they agree? Then we build it properly. She turned toward the exit. As she reached the door, she paused. You never mentioned the shutdown. It wasn't structural. The door closed behind her. By the time she returned to corporate headquarters, acquisition language was already being drafted. Microhook. The board begins reconsidering acquisition. The Manufacturing Leadership Summit was not designed for apologies. It was a stage for projections, acquisitions, and forward-looking statements delivered under bright lights. Executives filled the front rows. Analysts hovered near charging stations. Cameras framed the podium. Victoria Hale stepped forward without her usual slide deck of expansion charts. Behind her, the screen displayed a single image, Riverbend's curved intake arcs drawn in clean white lines. For 14 years, she began evenly. Vaughan Automotive has credited its growth to modernization. She paused. We overlooked something foundational. A faint murmur moved through the audience. The lean production system that powered our early expansion was designed by Daniel Mercer. The next slide showed a side-by-side comparison, straight-line throughput versus curved redistribution arcs. During restructuring, she continued, we straightened that geometry for speed. It improved short-term output. It increased long-term defect cost. Silence thickened. Riverbend reinstated the original arcs, she said. Since then, defect rates have dropped 12%. Warranty claims have declined. Distributor retention has stabilized. The numbers glowed behind her. Effective immediately, Vaughan Automotive will implement a company-wide restructuring initiative restoring the original lean geometry under Daniel Mercer's oversight. She stepped slightly aside. Riverbend will remain independently owned and operated. The word independently lingered. A reporter raised his hand. Is this an acquisition? No, Victoria replied. It is alignment. Another question followed. You once labeled Riverbend inefficient. Yes. And now? It is essential. The admission was steady. Daniel stood in the front row, hands loosely clasped. When prompted, he approached the podium without haste. The system works, he said evenly, because it redistributes pressure instead of forcing it. He pointed toward the projected arcs. When you straighten curves for speed, stress accumulates invisibly. Eventually, it surfaces as cost. The room listened carefully. Restoring the arcs isn't nostalgia, he continued. It's structure. There was no mention of humiliation. No recounting of shutdowns or public mockery. Just geometry. Victoria nodded beside him. This restructuring includes independent engineering review protocols, she added. No structural simplification will proceed without long-term modeling. Applause followed, but measured. Afterward, analysts approached Daniel not with congratulations, but with questions about timing intervals and buffer ratios. He answered briefly. Riverbend would remain independent. Vaughn would recalibrate. The market would adjust. His revenge had not been humiliation. It had been sustainable success. Precision restored. And precision, once proven, did not need spectacle to endure. Riverbend reopened without ribbon-cutting ceremonies. There were no brass bands, no oversized checks, no ceremonial shovels. Just a line of trucks pulling into the lot at 6:10 a.m., headlights cutting through the morning haze. Marcus Chin stepped out first. He had supervised Station 3 before the shutdown. When the plant closed, he drove 40 miles each way to work warehouse shifts that paid less and demanded more. He stood at the gate for a second longer than necessary before swiping the new access card. Inside, the curved intake arcs were already marked in fresh paint. They looked like they had always been there. More workers followed, machinists, technicians, inspectors. Some were cautious. Others moved with the familiarity of muscle memory rediscovered. They didn't ask if the geometry would hold. They felt it. The first shift moved without rush. Torque verification preceded detailing. Suspension alignment was recalibrated before cosmetic polish. Buffer zones absorbed minor delays instead of forcing overtime spikes. By the end of the first week, defect rates dropped below Vaughn's previous best quarter. The diner across the street reopened its morning breakfast service. The hardware supplier extended hours. A vacant storefront leased to a fabrication specialist within 3 weeks. The neighborhood didn't celebrate. It stabilized. Daniel kept his original garage sign. He didn't rebrand Riverbend under corporate banners. Instead, he mounted the old Whitaker Auto Repair sign inside the new facility's main entry hall. The faded letters hung above the doorway between intake and inspection, a quiet reminder of origin. A reporter asked him once why he didn't replace it. "Because it still works," he said. Each morning, he unlocked the smaller garage before sunrise and brewed coffee there first. He reviewed Riverbend's production metrics from the previous day and walked the curved arc himself, adjusting timing intervals by seconds if needed. He didn't move into a corporate office. He didn't request executive privileges. He worked on the floor. Apprentices from the local technical college rotated through both sites. He showed them how to read load distribution curves and how to recognize imbalance before it became visible failure. "Don't chase speed," he told them. "Chase structure." The workers returned quietly. The paychecks resumed. The arcs held. And Daniel continued working without spectacle, just as he always had. Daniel unlocked the front door just before sunset. The kitchen light hummed softly, casting a warm glow over the small wooden table. Lily sat there with colored pencils scattered around her, tongue pressed against her lip in concentration. The stuffed rabbit leaned against a glass of milk, its stitched smile steady. "You're early," she said. "Looks like it." She turned the paper toward him. It was the old garage drawn beside the new factory. The faded Whitaker Auto Repair sign hung above one door, and curved lines, uneven but deliberate, looped across the factory floor. Small stick figures stood inside both buildings. "They're connected," she explained. Daniel studied the drawing quietly. "They are," he said. She tapped the curved lines with her finger. "I made them bendy." "Good." He walked to the counter and opened the drawer beneath it. Inside lay his original workflow blueprints, creased at the edges, graphite arcs still precise despite the years. He placed Lily's drawing gently on top of them, aligning the edges carefully. Paper over paper. Past and present layered without tension. He closed the drawer softly. Outside, the factory lights glowed across the lot. The curved intake arcs moved in steady rhythm. The old garage sign remained mounted inside Riverbend's entry hall, unchanged. There were no speeches waiting for him at home. No banners. No triumphant music. Just the steady breath of a system restored to balance. Daniel sat at the table while Lily returned to coloring. The cracked tile beneath his feet remained cracked. The light flickered once, then steadied. Quiet dignity did not need applause. It needed alignment. And alignment, once restored, holds.